begin with that, Brian Hancock from the EAC. Brian?
Thank you, Co-Chairs Bauer and Ginsburg and Commissioners. We certainly appreciate the opportunity the Election Commission has to testify before the Commission today. My testimony this afternoon is not going to focus particularly on the mechanics of conformity assessment and product certification, but I thought what I'd do instead is to provide a reminder, I guess, of some of the less well-known aspects of our program that I think really add value to our program. We'll talk about that a little bit, and I will finish off with a little bit of a discussion on where I see election technology going in the future. Our quality monitoring program is where I want to start, and that quality monitoring aspect of our program provides an important additional layer of control by allowing the EAC to perform manufacturing site reviews, to carry out reviews of fielded voting systems, and to gather information on voting system anomalies from election officials. We feel that these tools help ensure that voting systems continue to meet the requirements of the voting system standards as those systems are manufactured, as they're delivered, and as they're used in federal elections. As another means of gathering data, the EAC collects information from election officials who field EAC-certified voting systems. Information on actual voting system field performance is a basic means of assessing the effectiveness of the certification program and of the quality of the manufacturing process. The EAC provides mechanisms for election officials to provide real-world input on voting system anomalies via the Voting Systems Report Collection published at eac.gov and through regular direct contact with certification division staff at in-person meetings, as well as email and telephone contact. The final prong in our quality monitoring program is our process of fielded system review and testing. We have the ability, upon invitation of a state or local election authority, to conduct reviews of fielded systems that were EAC certified. This review may include the testing of a fielded system if deemed necessary. Any anomalies found during this review and testing are provided to that election jurisdiction, to the manufacturer, and to any other jurisdiction using that voting system. We've done one of these reviews fairly recently in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, and I'll leave it to the folks in Ohio to determine what they thought of our participation in that process. We've also done a number of efforts to try to streamline our process. We certainly have heard that the process is cumbersome, often takes too long, and costs too much. But since the initiation of the testing and certification program, we have practiced incremental improvement in response to these comments, and we continue to respond to both real and perceived criticisms of our process. Since 2009, we've initiated a number of specific programmatic changes to address some of these criticisms. We've introduced weekly teleconferences with voting system manufacturers and test labs for each of our major voting system test campaigns. This way, communication is there on a constant basis. Everybody knows where the system is in the process and where the problems might be. We've adopted standardized response timeframes for EAC staff and technical reviewers to comment on issues that we see in both test plans and test reports. We've expanded the definition of de minimis change to permit the replacement of equivalent laptops, desktops, servers, printers, keyboards, and a number of other things. And that certainly, we believe, is a use to election officials and does add some speed to the process. We've also attempted, to the extent that we can, to push voting system manufacturers to have their systems completely ready for testing before they begin their test campaigns with the EAC VSTLs. In the past, I think there have been instances of voting system manufacturers beginning test campaigns with our VSTLs before their systems were ready, and this certainly increased for them the time and cost. And so things in that area, I believe, have improved significantly. And just an example of that, the most recent voting system modification certified by the EAC, in fact, finished this week, was completed end-to-end, start to finish in 50 days. And so I think for a modification, that's a fairly reasonable time frame. Thanks. We're also considering additional process changes to further reduce time and cost. Some of these changes, again, as mentioned earlier, would require a quorum of EAC commissioners, but one of them that we've discussed with election officials is the potential for introducing the process of manufactured declaration of conformity for specific VVSG requirements. It's a process that has never been used in elections before, but is certainly used in many other industries around the world. Certainly, voting is not ready for something like that in all areas of the standards, but we do think there are very specific areas where it might be useful. And so we'd like to explore that if we could, and we will do so in the future. About the future voting technology. It certainly would be wonderful if we could discuss future voting technology and point to some radical new technology or new device that would solve all of our voting-related problems, from long lines to voter identification to anything else you want to mention. Unfortunately, I don't see any such radical technological developments in the near future for elections. To my way of thinking, this is probably actually a good thing. I'm not sure that we ever want election administration exploring the boundaries of technology. New technology often fails, and failure in elections is too high a price to pay for simply experimenting with some new technology. What we're seeing, and what I think we will continue to see, are implementations of existing technologies that may be new for the field of election administration. Everything we've talked about today, none of it is new technology. Some of it is actually very old technology, but it is new for election administration, and I think we'll continue to see that. And all this is not to say that progress is non-existent in the voting systems arena. In fact, some really exciting developments are happening, and we've certainly heard some of those recently from Ken and Dana, and you've heard from Dean Logan in the past. And from my perspective, the really innovative aspect of this work is not the technology itself, but actually the process. The LA County project is breaking new ground in the way voting systems are procured. The VSAP, as you've heard, takes a participatory approach to this process, and their advisory committee is made up of numerous local constituencies, more than probably we want to name right now. In addition, their development and procurement process is based on desirable characteristics of a system and not bound by the constraints of the current market products, as you've heard. And certainly these characteristics include mobility, security, usability, and accessibility, flexibility, maintainability, auditability, and cost effectiveness. A very daunting task, no doubt. But certainly all of us in the voting technology area are eagerly awaiting the results of what's happening in LA County, and I'm happy to say I'm a very small part of that process, and looking forward to our next meeting out there, Ken. For the first time in my experience, we're also seeing real progress in the areas of usability and accessibility. Even though HAVA, as we all know, required votings to be accessible for individuals with all types of disabilities, the reality has often not met these very laudable goals. Paper handling has always been a major issue that was brought up earlier today, and we're, I think, finally seeing voting systems that are integrating, as you heard, the ballot marking device and the ballot box to solve this issue. We're also now seeing voting system manufacturers designing systems for usability for both voters and for poll workers. We're seeing an increased use of some of the design for democracy templates for both the design of paper ballots as well as the design of user interfaces for voting devices and election management systems. Finally, I do see some potential for introducing technological developments into elections that have been implemented in other industries. One example of this is tablet devices used in the medical industry. Because of the rigorous security and privacy demands of this industry, tablet implementations have already been introduced with innovations that may have implications for election administration. Some of these include hot swap batteries with up to 6.5 hours of battery life. The tablets also contain anti-theft, encryption, and performance management functions that I think would be very useful in election administration. So I'm very interested to see if some of these devices will be piloted in configurations that would allow them to be used in election administration. With that, I'll move on. We have a very full agenda this afternoon and be happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was anticipating speaking later, so you didn't give me a chance to get nervous yet.
Someone's got to go first.
I have some slides in, great, thank you. So starting with the second slide. So NIST has been working in voting activities under HAVA since approximately 2003. And if we could move to the second slide, please. Okay. So just wanted to, my purpose here was just to point out what we've been doing and, what we're doing at present, given the situation without commissioners. So, we were working primarily with the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, and you've heard about that. Essentially 15 members from different disciplines and chaired by the director of NIST. Oh, thank you. And in a ridiculously short amount of time mandated by HAVA, we updated the existing standards as they were, which was the 2002 voting system standards. We had roughly about 4 months to do that, and everybody in the process agreed that this was too short of a time and it really didn't permit the sorts of updates that were really needed. So we took an additional, a little bit less than 2 years to produce a revision of that, and even that was not enough time. But a good thing was that the TGDC process was public and mandated that there be a stopping point. So we did produce those. Those ultimately, for a number of reasons, did not get approved at the EAC, and primarily having to do with the auditability requirements that, in effect, pretty much required paper records for voting systems as an audit trail. And we were, along in this process, performing various research in voting technologies. And the other thing that we've been doing since then and continue to do is inspect voting system labs and accredit them. And we essentially say they are accredited, certified to perform voting system testing, and then recommended to the EAC. The EAC can levy additional criteria if they want. And, currently, I think there are 2 voting system test labs and one awaiting EAC accreditation, but I can't get that obviously until commissioners are present. And I just, okay, let's see if I can figure out how to use this next. Okay. We have been, in our voting program, working on a number of other activities as well, in generally providing support to the EAC right now. So we've been working on updating the current VVSG 1.0 with a revision, which we recently finished up some public review comment reviews on those comments. And again, that is stalled, though. The EAC can't move forward on that until commissioners are underway. And we've been working in a number of other areas as well. Test assertions, what that essentially means is clarifying what the requirements in VVSG 1.1 mean and how specifically they are to be tested. Helping in some areas, helping to automate source code analysis by the testing labs. They spend a large amount of their time on source code analysis, and a number of opinions indicate that it would be better to spend less time, automate that to the extent possible, and put more time into things such as penetration testing and other tests more suitable. A number of other areas, security-related research, which I'll defer to my colleague Josh Franklin, working on a common data format with IEEE, continuing with our test lab accreditation program. And then the common data format project that I'm most closely associated with is kind of an XML-based format. The idea has been to have a common import-export format for voting systems, and in a dream world, have the systems be totally interoperable. The idea being that instead of if a jurisdiction decides that They need to acquire new vote capture devices, new DREs, new optical scanners. The idea being that they could pull out their existing ones, look at any that are on the market, pick which one is best, and then put that in. And that has a lot of merit in it. It hopefully will be possible at a particular point. We're working with the IEEE for historical reasons more so than starting afresh with the IEEE. But it appears to be working out, and in this particular process, I think we have a fairly balanced pool of different parties involved, especially manufacturers. There weren't manufacturers involved, as you've heard before, so much with the TGDC until the last incarnation. And then I think we had Ed Smith, who was at the table earlier from Dominion. So it's working along. I will have to say that it's a standards effort that needs to be driven. So NIST is driving it right now. It contrasts in a lot of ways from the TGDC effort. The TGDC effort needed someone to drive it as well, and that's why NIST was involved. So just having a different standards organization involved doesn't necessarily make it better. It still requires someone to move it along and drive it and make it better. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that, we talked about this already, the fact that the standards are fairly old. So the VVSG 1.0 is a good standard in a lot of ways, has received a lot of attention from the EAC with various smaller updates and decisions on RFIs. But it was developed back in 2005, and it inherited a lot of material from previous standards. The 1.1 is stalled. A lot of new devices out. Looking through previous testimony and items submitted to the commission, a number of states are involved in things such as electronic blank ballot distribution and using systems that are connected to networks. So there have to be more requirements developed for these sorts of systems, and more, most importantly, ability to test them, ability to do different types of testing. I mentioned penetration testing already. The current process that we have right now doesn't really permit timely updates. It takes a while, and there's a very big public review process associated with it. And given the rate of change and new ideas coming up, a more flexible arrangement really is needed. We've all been talking about this for a number of years and have a number of ideas, but it seems imperative to really move towards a situation. The problem, if we don't do that, is if we end up spending a lot of money on newer systems and then we develop standards later, is we effectively subject a lot of people to needless hassle where people will not be satisfied with offerings. People will complain, because new standards are out there and the older equipment don't meet them, and a number of situations associated with that. So the best scenario would be to have new standards that address new technologies and then have the equipment follow along. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you. Josh Franklin from NIST.
Testing, check. Okay. Debit, credit. So thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss NIST's research efforts to improve the election process for military and overseas voters. Our nation's military and citizens living abroad experience significant difficulty in obtaining, marking, and returning absentee ballots. NIST recognizes the importance of using technology to make overseas voting more reliable and secure. Over the past 5 years, NIST has worked with election administrators, technologists, and other members of the elections community to identify risks, mitigations, and best practices on the use of technology in the UOCAVA voting process. NIST's first document, titled "A Threat Analysis on UOCAVA Voting Systems," documented threats to these voting systems using electronic technologies for all aspects of the overseas voting process. NIST's work then became focused on researching specific technologies for disparate election processes, and providing mitigating controls whenever possible. And we actually produced three documents in that effort. In 2011, the EAC's Technical Guidelines and Development Committee directed its UOCAVA working group to compare the current UOCAVA voting process to potential electronic absentee voting systems used by military and overseas voters. NIST facilitated the working group in identifying risks and mitigations associated with voter registration, ballot delivery, receipt, and tabulation. Since that time, NIST has continued the work to both refine and document the group's findings. The results of this risk assessment can be used as a baseline against which to compare future electronic absentee voting systems. For example, electronic technologies introduce new types of risks to the election process, but also provide new and innovative methods for improving the voting process. There are a number of opportunities for voters to make mistakes in the current UOCAVA voting process, as voters manually complete registration forms and mark their ballots. Illegible handwriting and ambiguous marks may lead to voters being incorrectly registered or having their ballots incorrectly counted. Online ballot marking and online voter registration systems can substantially mitigate risks typically associated with human error, but they also introduce new risks into the voting process. This report that we are developing is meant to assist election officials in assessing this whole risk trade-off. New technology is fundamentally altering the voting experience in our nation, creating new opportunities for research. NIST's previous research into UOCAVA voting identified several significant challenges for remote voting systems, most notably voter authentication, auditability, and endpoint security. Our nation currently lacks a public infrastructure that could facilitate secure voter authentication for remote voting systems, ensuring that errors, defects, and attacks on elections can be detected through post-election audits has proved very, very difficult with electronic voting systems. Malware and other attacks on voters' personal computers also pose a serious threat. Exciting new research is being performed to address these challenges. Through the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, NIST is working with the private sector, civil liberties, and public sector to lay down the foundation for interoperable, trusted credentials provided by private companies, advanced cryptographic voting protocols may be able to provide new methods for auditing elections, although currently they often introduce new usability challenges. Finally, techniques to prevent attacks on personal computers have been implemented in Norway via voting receipts that do not divulge the voters' ballot selections. While progress is being made, additional research and pilot projects are actually needed to study the challenges and develop secure, usable, and cost-effective solutions. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Before we throw it open to a broader discussion on the certification process, there are two other aspects of it we'd like to touch on. And first, if James Long from Wiley Labs would give us your perspective.
Hi, Wiley would like to thank the Commission for the opportunity to provide a testimony. Wiley Labs, as John mentioned earlier, is one of two certified voting system test laboratories. You've heard a lot this morning from the vendors talking about the testing that's performed, and I would just like to kind of summarize some of that back to you. Wiley performs what's known as conformity testing, and as Ken mentioned this morning, that is a very black and white, all standards are equal testing. No standard is weighted higher than the other. To achieve a recommendation from our lab for certification, you have to be tested to and meet all requirements black and white. There's usually no middle ground. This is really important to bring up because we test to the standard. The current standard that's adopted and the only standard that can be tested to for the EAC program is the 2005 BVSG. As John just mentioned, that copy or that release of the standard is not what the community wanted at the time. There wasn't a lot of time to, make it what it needed to be. That's what brought about the 2007 revision, but it's what we move forward with. Commissioner Thomas mentioned, or actually posed the question to the manufacturers, asking whether or not the standard was impeding innovation. And from the lab's perspective, we've noticed, and in our testing process, that some of the requirements are outdated and have prevented newer practices from entering into the voting system. I'll provide a quick example. In the 1990 standard, there is a requirement centered around essentially central count units performance when scanning ballots, that they halt upon some type of multi-feed. So the technology back then was essentially, some of you guys probably even have this technology still, it's a single feeder, it's a single path, it goes into a single output. So the standard addressed that. You didn't want to lose track of these ballots, so the system was required to halt. Well, we've moved past that since 1990. By the way, that standard was repeated nearly verbatim in the 2005. So this system was being tested to the 2005. It has more options, multiple outputs, et cetera, et cetera. But it could handle this process in a very different way, but because the standard dictated that the system halt, it was actually non-conformant. So we had to find it as such. Now, since then, an RFI has been released by the EAC to help address this issue, but the system is still required to halt under the EAC program. So, you can kind of see how the standard is restricting a much better process of allowing the system to continue to process votes without pausing, because it has the ability to separate any of the ones that it cannot read. I'll also throw another example of where we believe the standard is a little dated. We're still using the coding standards that were taken from the 1990 standard and applying them to modern code base. So in 1990, I believe the 1990 standard was taken from a off-the-shelf coding book at the time, telling you how you should organize your code, what should be represented in your code. So once again, we've kind of moved past that, but because we still have to test to these old coding standards, the manufacturers invest a lot of time in retraining their own coders to these old coding practices, because most of us, started learning on object-oriented languages where these coding standards were, right before Java was even popular. So, I mentioned most of this to draw to the attention of the commission that we, as a lab, really need new standards. We only can test to what is approved, and, in the absence of a commission, we can't receive those new standards. They're there. John mentioned that there's actually two, revisions that are being worked on. One that's much further forward than the 1.1, which is a revision to the 2005. But even the incremental revision to the 2005, I think we would see, a large increase in, efficiency in the testing process. In addition, there's been some changes recommended in the program manual, which is also available, on the EAC's website to review. That touches on a subject that I heard, I think it was from Hart spoke, that there are no de minimis software changes. In the current manual, that is prohibited. In the new manual, it does open it back up for review, and that's very important because you could get small incremental changes. You want to change the font size of something. Well, maybe that's a bad example because of accessibility implications, but something really small. You want to change something in your source code. Now you have to come in for a modification, and the fastest one, like Brian just mentioned, is 50 days. I think that we can still beat that, and I think that's, admirable that we got to 50 days, but, for a small software improvement, it would be great to have a de minimis process for it. So, Wiley has been in the testing business since the early 1990s. So we have seen and observed both the pre-HAVA and the post-HAVA testing environment. In 2002, when HAVA was passed, it was a monumental piece of legislation. It was the first time that the federal government had ever invested or given funding to improving the elections administration process and for improving the technology in which voters vote upon. So, that pairs recently with President Obama's executive order. And, we sat down and we reviewed the executive order and, compared it to HAVA. And most aspects of the order are pretty close to what was in HAVA. So, our only takeaway from that is the work's not done yet. We haven't finished the work that we started in 2002, and I think this executive order, which established this commission, only reinforces that point, that there's still a lot of work for us to do, and under the legislation of HAVA, the EAC is in still the prime position to continue that work. So to continue down this path, before the EAC, it was it was essentially NASED, which was not directly funded from, my understanding of it. I wasn't around. I was too busy enjoying high school at that point. But from what I understand, it was not necessarily directly funded. It was more of a volunteer, group of state election officials and whatnot that were performing this testing. So there was inconsistencies. The level of scrutiny that we have now in the laboratories was not to the same level. And, I don't think that we want to move back to that model. We can state for a fact at Wiley that the systems are better. We're seeing a lot higher quality of system both coming in and, of course, leaving our laboratory. So I just reiterate that, moving away from this current model, I think is a little premature. Or to be suggesting that we move away from this model might be premature. And I feel that, the EAC gets judged too quickly by some people. This agency has been around for 10 years. But due to, the small size of this community and the small number of vendors, I think there's 5, maybe 6. I know there's only like 5 major ones, or 4. There haven't been a lot of systems submitted. I think there's close to 10 now full certifications, and Brian can correct me, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 12, 13 maybe modifications. And, people make this comparison to the FAA and all these other federal agencies. They receive more requests than that in a day. So, this program still has a long way to go, but it's still very in the maturing process. And only with more systems will it continue to get better. And only with commissioners will it be, allowed to progress. So on that, I think I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some states have also developed testing programs, and if Merle King could describe what you're doing in Georgia.
Okay, thank you. I'm Merle King, Executive Director, Center for Election Systems at Kennesaw State, and we provide services to the state of Georgia. I think as I've listened to the testimony here today, I think about what every election official thinks about after the election, which is what are the things that we're going to do the same, and what are the things that we're going to change. And the outcome of that, of course, is if we don't change anything, then our expectations of changed outcomes aren't very realistic. So what I'd like to do is address 3 areas that we may want to explore stasis and change in, and what we might expect if we make changes. The first is the certification process. The second is our myopic obsession with voting systems as opposed to election systems. And the third is core competencies. And there I use as an analogy, we talk about the innovations in the technology that we produce, much like an aircraft manufacturer might talk about innovations in aircraft. But the aircraft manufacturer also talks about the needed skills of the pilots, the needed skills of the aircraft maintenance, the needed skills of the instructors of the pilots, the needed resources in the air traffic control, et cetera. In other words, they would never dream of developing innovative technology and pushing it out the door without thinking through the implementation. So if I can talk about those 3 areas, certification, election systems versus voting systems, and then core competencies. Every jurisdiction has to figure out, in fact, what is certification. And at the very lowest, meanest level, certification is a checkbox on the RFP. We're required to have certification. And in a very elemental way, it is also viewed as indemnification. If we have a certified system, then somehow we're indemnified against negative outcomes in the election. And of course, that is not true. But if you move beyond that and you begin to look at certification as we do in the EAC context, and often in the state of Georgia, we look at it as conformance to a set of standards, then we begin to get benefit from it. But ultimately, the certification process, not certification as an awarding of status to product, but the process of certification, at its best and highest performing level, it is the revelation of the behaviors and the attributes and the limitations of that system. And that's where the benefit in the certification process comes, because ultimately, everything that we heard from the vendors this morning, what's back behind the innovations and the application of those technologies is always people and procedures and mitigations. And without the revelation that comes through an informed certification process, you don't gain the insights into what are the dependencies of the system. So we've talked, I've probably been on 30 conversations about security of voting systems that attempted to validate voter intent to votes cast. And I've only sat in on one discussion that talked about, did the voter get the right ballot? And that was a discussion that I led. And so what we emphasize in our certification process is this very narrow view of voting systems, when in fact the outcome of an election is almost certainly more dependent upon the performance of the election systems that surround it, the voter registration system, the online voter application system, the ballot on demand system, the electronic poll systems, the candidate qualifying systems. All of these have dependencies, bidirectional dependencies into the voting systems. So to only look at the voting system, declare it to be sufficient, and then go into an election thinking we've got our arms around this, that's one of those questions we have to say, are we going to do it the same, or are we going to change? So the other things that I think are very important to think about in terms of certification, it's a heuristic process. You learn as a part of performing the certification test. It is not a static process. So the notion of having a static set of standards to go into a certification, it seems odd at best, bizarre in reality. That as the threat vectors, the things that can disrupt an election begin to manifest itself, your certification strategy has to be able to adapt to that so that you are evaluating the ability of that system to function in real time, in real environment, against known and emerging threats to disrupt that election. So that's the first thing is, do we want to keep doing certification like we've been doing it? And if we do, we're going to get the same cost structure basically out of the process, probably with improvements, the same time interval, and about the same degree of reliance on the outcome of it. The second thing is this notion that voting systems drive the election to the exclusion of everything else. And if you talk to an election official, the things they worry about is not the voting system. And the irony is we just keep testing the same thing over and over again. The one part that we know works, we just keep testing it. And the other parts where we know the vulnerabilities are in the voter registration systems, in the electronic poll books, in the myriad of processes that surround the election, we put blinders on. We let the vendors test that. We let the vendor declare the sufficiency of those systems, and we continue to focus on the voting system. So one of the things that I think we have to think about as a community, do we keep doing that, or do we broaden the scope of our inspection of the election process to include election systems, which is that collection of systems that collect, manipulate, store, and present data associated with the election. And it's a growing list. If you ask the vendors where the innovation is, it is not in the voting systems. The innovations are in the election systems, and because that's where the margin is, that's where the market is, and it's very, very poorly understood by the media. It's poorly understood by analysts who attempt to analyze elections. They don't fully understand the dependencies between those systems. The third thing has to do with the core competency of election officials. And one of the things that we talk about, certainly within our state and elsewhere, is the notion that every election official is an IT manager. And that's whether they think they are, whether they want to be, whether they were trained to be. They are managing IT, and they're managing complex IT in a complex environment. I can go into the smallest county in Georgia, and the election official in that county is managing more IT than the IT manager in that county, with often greater consequence. So this notion that we have this large collection of election workers out there, election officials, poll workers, poll managers, for which we have never as a collective defined what are their core competencies. What is it that we expect an election official to know? And if we don't know that, then how do we evaluate their performance? How do we recruit them? How do we develop training programs for them? So if you live in a jurisdiction where the criteria for being an election official is that you can win a campaign to become an election official, then that is the core competency of the election official in that jurisdiction. So as we look at what are the things as a community that we need to articulate about expectations of competencies in election officials, certainly some ability to manage IT, awareness of election law, awareness of project management, all of those things that we know as election officials are a part of that, and make sure that that's communicated. So again, I think in assessing where we are, if we come out of this election cycle and we say essentially every election official gets to define their own level of competency, every poll manager gets to define their own level of competency, then we can't really expect much difference in the change down the road. So having said all that, there are many, many things that are going right with elections. And I think most of us who have been in it for a while certainly feel that the equipment that we're using today is better, but we also agree that the environment that we work in is more risk-laden and it is more complex than it was years ago. And so what I would encourage election officials and the commission to look at is really those three areas: the certification process, both at the federal, state level, look at the need to expand the emphasis to review the interaction of election systems with the voting system as opposed to a strict focus on voting systems. And then finally, helping to define what are the core competencies, what should we be able to expect of election officials in every jurisdiction in this country. And I think those are the changes that I would like to see. And I thank the commission for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. What we would like to do now is sort of engage in the roundtable discussion on some of these basic issues, starting off with the certification process, if we could, largely because as the commission has traveled around and talked to all the groups that we've talked to, election officials have told us a lot about the certification process. And it is worth kind of putting all that on the record and telling us how you believe the certification works and how it could be improved. Certainly, Doug Lewis of the Election Center, we have heard a number of things from members of yours, and I wonder if you could summarize that and give us your views on it. Kick things off.
I'm Doug Lewis, Executive Director of the Election Center in Houston. Clearly, I think you all got an earful when your commissioners attended our conference in August. And over the years, truthfully, the elections community, I think, was happy to have the federal government finally take a role in terms of testing and to actually fund some of that and involve NIST in the process and to build a program in that. And certainly NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, worked with Brian to turn over all of the data that we had over the years. And there has been enormous criticism of the process and the program. I don't think all of it has been justified as relates to the EAC itself, but certainly some of my members, some of whom are even sitting behind me, don't necessarily agree with what I just said. And so the problem is right now, the process doesn't work. It doesn't work very well at all. And it's not that I'm critical of the EAC or any of our elections officials are critical of the EAC in this regard. This has become dysfunctional because Congress itself has made it dysfunctional. We're at the point where the agency can't even get commissioners. If we can't get commissioners, we certainly can't build standards. And if we can't do standards, we can't make the improvements that NIST is recommending and that James would like to test to and that Brian would like to implement and have something function. The process is broken. It doesn't work. States now are moving to do their own testing and their own standards and hire their own laboratories to do some of this. Dana and Ken are having to go out and design systems. And let me tell you why they're having to design systems. The manufacturers want to manufacture anything they can sell. The truth of the matter is they can't manufacture the systems these two people want unless they can figure out a way to sell more of them later. And the political environment in which the manufacturers have to operate at this point is that they cannot buy those new electronic systems or well-designed systems or what the marketplace, what the voters really want. We can't provide the voters what they want. The truth is the manufacturers are able to sell what is politically possible for them to sell and us to buy. And as long as that remains the system, along with a process that in testing takes forever and standards development take forever. Unfortunately, as you all have discovered as commissioners on this federal commission, I'm going to guess you've discovered that the federal government moves at two speeds, glacial and eternal, you know. In order for us to get standards through, you're going to have to live as long as Methuselah in order to make it all work. That is unacceptable in elections. We are trying as elections administrators all over the country to run safe and secure elections. We're also trying to listen to our customer base, and we keep talking that we want these young people to come into the process. Young people are not going to vote on paper. Well, I say that, and I would have said to you that by now we would have been maybe out of the paper phase of elections, but I've lived long enough that AT&T in 1964 went around talking about this wonderful invention of the touch-tone telephone that they had, and that within 2 years we were all going to be voting on touch-tone telephone. Well, here we are all those years later, and we're still not doing it. And we may very well be on paper long after I'm dead and gone. The problem is that we hold electronic systems to a standard we don't hold paper to. You still want to manipulate an election, you manipulate it through paper, not through electronic systems. We have got to get to the point that we can have standards that are meaningful and relevant, that manufacturers can actually design systems. They're not like Apple. Apple decides they're going to create a marketplace. They go out and create a marketplace. They create a product that they think the public will buy. They get out there, they sell it. Here, we're not allowed to do that. And so until we look at this whole process all over again, until we get to the point that we understand absolutes are not necessarily possible, and we can't continue to make trade-offs that say, but only this one is absolutist enough for us to pay attention to. Unfortunately, as you all know, where we are with Congress itself is absolutes. You've either got to absolutely be for our point of view or we're not going to do anything. And this is the environment in which we in elections operate. We can't do this anymore. 1990, isn't that what you all are saying? Is basically we've made some minor revisions over a period of time to 1990. My God, how long is this going to take? It makes no sense. We've got to, if the strongest recommendation that you folks can recommend is that Congress and leaders stand up to their political supporters to say we're not going to do insane things anymore. We are going to do things that mean we can make this process work for voters and work well for voters. The truth is we keep talking about how do we integrate paper with electronic stuff. Look, electronic stuff was going to allow us to redesign the whole process. It meant that instead of forcing voters to come to us, we could have gone to voters. We can't do that yet. And that's, of all the things that are out in society, they go directly to consumers anymore, but we can't. This is a situation that has to change. What would I recommend for the voting systems testing program? You all need to make a very, very strong recommendation that Congress do one of two things. Either they get up off their duff and get off their political high horse and commit to allowing this federal agency to exist and to do its job with commissioners and with funding, or they tell us they're going to eliminate it and we're on our own to figure it out, because we'll figure it out if that's the case. We can't continue to be in limbo, which is what we've been, and I'll hush at that point.
Thank you. Any thoughts from anyone at the table on that subject who may be directly in the field? Mr. Kennedy?
well, maybe a more measured response.
You set a high bar.
I think, you have gathered today probably some of the best experts, those people on the cutting edge that you heard from earlier, people who have been in the trenches, and Doug gave you not only a passionate background, but a historical perspective. And I think, you heard from, in other situations, that there is a problem with the certification process. And it's important to us as election administrators because from our perspective, it's exactly what the mission of this commission is. Your tag is support the voter, and it really is about the voter. And for us to serve the voters, we have to give them a means to participate in the process that they're confident in. When Merle King said, what is our goal? We have competing goals. It really boils down to serving the voter. That's our goal, and then we build from that. And that's high talk, more in Doug's line. But practically speaking, we have to get to making the process more efficient. And I realize you're not in a position necessarily to recommend legislation, but you have to identify the problem. And you've heard very clearly that we're not serving the voter with the type of equipment that's available. We're not serving the election official with the type of equipment that's available. We need a process that allows us to take advantage of the technologies that exist now and implement them. And you'll hear more from me tomorrow about how we've done some of that, but you've heard already today great ideas on how to do that. And what I would say is you build on some of the very valuable comments that came from the people on the ground on this side, as well as the people who are working to serve the voter, the election officials.
If I could, and there are other topics we're going to obviously cover here, but Kevin, could you, Doug laid out a diagnosis in no uncertain terms. He had a particular view of what was wrong. And by the way, Doug, insofar as telling off the congressional leadership, Ben's prepared to do it, and I'll be right behind him. I'm going to stand right behind him, and every step of the way he'll have my encouragement. Talking to Steny Hoyer next. Yeah. I'm putting Ben together with the Democratic leader. Yeah, no, yeah. But Kevin, do you want to comment on Doug laid out what he thought was wrong. Are there any areas there where you would, setting aside the question of, how strongly Doug expressed his view and your view being perhaps somewhat different in tone, agree, disagree, add, subtract?
Well, I think you break it down like you heard the election officials do. You look at, what do we need? We need a set of standards. Doug was very eloquent in this, as were the people who are working with the standards, in describing the fact that the standards haven't changed in over 20 years. And yet we have other ways to define those standards. And so we need to have some kind of a commitment. I mean, election officials took this in hand back in 1990 to design standards because we wanted a safe harbor to show to our voters we're not just letting something be manufactured in somebody's garage for you to vote on. I remember getting a phone call from someone saying, I know how to solve the problem of the 2000 election. I used to work for NCR, the cash register company, and I've designed a voting system based on a cash register, and I thought it was kind of ironic. But it was the idea that someone would cook up those things, and we aren't able to turn to our voters and give them some level of confidence. The reason why states, including Wisconsin, are stepping outside of the system is because we have to. We don't have any choice anymore. We thought that the federal system would give us a good opportunity to have something we could point to why these voting systems are trusted and reliable, but it hasn't been flexible. And so, fortunately, like in Wisconsin, we designed our approval process where we can step outside of that. And we did it unfortunately, for a backward step to allow our municipalities to use modems to send unofficial results on election night because the system was so rigid it wasn't going to address that. And very good reasons for that, but we had to step out and test old technology just to satisfy a political need, but at least we had the flexibility to do that. I would rather be more forward-seeking. I would not want to be relying on analog modems to transmit unofficial election results. I'd rather serve the voter with those election night results in more efficient ways. And the solutions I had didn't involve technology. They involved sending people out to the polling places, like the League of Women Voters used to do, to call those results in, but to bring the technology back to the central count. So we need to have new standards, and we need to have some flexibility to deal with things in the many processes that Merle King talked about that touch on this. So that's where, that's what I would look at is what exactly are the steps? How can we get new standards in a very efficient way? Does that mean we rely on the EAC, or do we rely on some other type of entity to do that? States are picking up those standards. They're drawing things with each other, but to value things for the taxpayer, we have to work together. California's got more resources than Wisconsin does, but we watch what California's doing, we watch what Texas is doing, and we take those techniques so that we can use them in Wisconsin. And so that's how I would look at this is, let's go back and take the process, and how can we improve those steps?
Thank you. One of the other interesting facets that the Commission's been dealing with has been the subject of voting technology. And Martha, you're doing some innovative work in your field, and if you could fill us in.
Along with Dr. David Kimball next to me, I'm Martha Croft. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We, for a number of years, have been working on ballot design issues as well as voting technology issues. And of course, we worked with Dana and Whitney with some graphic design of ballots. And one thing that we find is that the usability of ballots in the past has been really bad. They haven't been friendly to voters, and it's less a technological issue than the certification of ballots. But certainly we have voluntary standards created by the EAC there too. So, but yet they're voluntary. But it was refreshing to see this morning some of the equipment vendors actually using some of the design standards in the creation of their ballots. One thing that I would encourage, though, the vendors and the election officials to think about is that we are in a federal system wherein we occasionally use alternative voting systems like cumulative voting or like instant runoff voting. And there are difficulties in making, apparently, from what I understand, a lot of the systems aren't friendly to alternative voting systems that are used as remedies for Voting Rights Act violations. And so I think I would encourage the Commission to not just consider our straightforward voting for federal offices, but also the use of some of these alternative voting systems that are being used in programs across the country. But one thing that also occurs to me is it's not just usability of ballots, but acceptance of the technology on the part of the voters. And I hear a lot about security of the voting systems, and I think we're doing a lot, and we're doing some of the right things, although it's clear that the certification needs to be updated. But I think that our number one goal needs to be about creating a legitimate election, and so having our ears to the ground on public opinion in terms of how accepting they are of some of these technologies. I think that the typical voter is going to be more accepting of voting technologies than we give them credit for, particularly electronic voting technologies. And I don't think that this is something that a lot of state legislatures are hearing. And unfortunately, that's something that the Commission can do very little about because unless it's encouraging the state legislatures to change their ways. But North Carolina, for example, while some of the new technology coming in is going to go back maybe a step to paper receipts that people could actually hold in their hands, rather than the ability of about 50 of the counties are actually using electronic equipment, and I guess the next generation is not going to be so in North Carolina. That's just one example. And then finally, I would just encourage one of the vendors this morning mentioned the use of residual votes as a measure of how well the voting equipment is doing. And I'll just throw it out, I'm sure that Dr. Stewart has addressed that as well, but that we should use that with caution, as occasionally residual votes are not just the result of, while I myself have used it as a measure, it's also voluntary occasionally and due to a lot of contextual factors. So,
Thank you. David Kimball?
thank you.
Thanks. David Kimball. I'm at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And I'll just apologize in advance if Martha and I duck out before the session ends to catch our flights home. Martha covered our research, so I'll just add a couple of comments and one question sort of on the topics today. One, I think some of the technological solutions we saw this morning were geared at reducing long lines at polling places, and some recent studies indicate that the main bottleneck at polling places is in checking in voters rather than the act of actually casting the ballot. And I mean, to be fair, I think some of the tech stuff demoed this morning gets at the voting line issue, but I think more attention might be paid to the process of checking in voters, not just the act of casting a ballot. And even maybe some like mundane, non-technical solutions might apply, like simply having enough tables and enough poll workers at least at peak voting hours, so that the check-in process goes more quickly. That's sort of one comment. The second, to pick up on what some of the election officials mentioned earlier, particularly Matt Masterson, I think one hurdle to innovation in voting and election technology is the fact that we have a very decentralized administrative structure for running elections in the United States. There's roughly 8,000 local jurisdictions that administer federal elections. I think one reason why, earlier it was mentioned that other countries have kind of moved ahead of us, and I think most other countries, the national government can simply decree nationwide, we're going to adopt this new technology, boom, done. You know, that's not feasible and probably not a good idea in the U.S. given our administrative structure. And in addition, there's a tremendous disparity in the size of local jurisdictions. That about 400 local jurisdictions, just 5% of the total, serve about 70% of the voters in the United States. 5% of the jurisdictions serve 70% of the voters. And I think all the local jurisdictions represented in the room today are very large local jurisdictions. They've got at least 100,000 or more registered voters, which puts them at like the 96th percentile in terms of size. And LA County is at like the 99.9th percentile in terms of size. So, but that makes sense. Much of the demand for innovation is coming from the large local jurisdictions because many of the challenges and problems in running elections, long lines, undeliverable mail, unreturned absentee ballots, difficulties finding and training poll workers, all those challenges are disproportionately concentrated in a small number of urban jurisdictions. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's lots of small towns and rural counties that probably don't want to pay the cost of any new voting technology, and the officials serving those smaller jurisdictions can probably argue with justification that their voters aren't demanding any new technology. So the suggestion I would make for consideration is this is more for state governments than the federal government, but state election laws and regulations might be crafted or modified to allow more flexibility at the local level, so that if large jurisdictions want to buy e-poll books, or if they want to adopt mobile apps, or if they want to expand early voting, let them do so. But if smaller jurisdictions in the same state don't want to pay the cost for those innovations, then let the small jurisdictions forego those innovations, just for consideration. The question I had, and this may be a dumb question because I don't understand much about the contracting process, purchasing process. But I'm wondering if it would help, or if it's possible for there to be greater transparency in purchasing contracts. So that, for example, if Michigan comes up with a new purchasing model so that you're not vendor dependent for the next 10 years, is it possible, or can other state and local election officials see that contract so that when it comes time for them to buy or lease new equipment, they get good value for their money? So I'll leave it at that.
If commissioners have any questions at this point, especially for Martha and David, because they do have to leave now. Nate?
Can I just ask a quick question? This is probably more for the standards folks, which is, if I'm a new voting machine maker, how much is it going to cost for me to get my system certified? I mean, if you give me a ballpark figure of what it's going to take, maybe James, you're the one to ask.
All right, so I'm going to hedge a lot here. Are any of my customers here? It is very dependent on two things. One, the size of the system, and two, how prepared the manufacturer is for testing. The smaller of A and the greater of B equals a much shorter and much cheaper testing campaign.
All right, let me push you. I've heard it's between $3 and $4 million. Is that ballpark what it's costing some of the vendors who are trying to enter the space?
I don't have the numbers. I know that the most recent ones in which I've participated in, they have not exceeded that number. That's anything from, let's say, at least the previous 5 systems have not exceeded that number. But that goes back to when I joined Wiley. Before that, I have no idea.
Yeah, just from experience, I can tell you that the early systems that came in that weren't ready, and if you go and look at the test reports and the number of discrepancies, we're talking hundreds and close to thousands of discrepancies in testing. It's probably accurate to say $3 to $4 million. That's probably a correct statement. It's my belief, knowing the process, knowing the requirements, that a system could get through testing in 12 months to 16 months at around $1 million for a new voting system. Again, it's very dependent on size. If you're talking central scanner, precinct scanners, all that, that's going to, but knowing the requirements, and if someone is ready to test, they've evaluated their system internally, that system can get through, in my opinion, in 12 months and right around $1 million. So.
Brian Hancock, and just adding on to that a little bit, I mentioned the modification that we just did that was done in 50 days. I mean, that was a fairly small modification, but it does show you that it can be done in a fairly reasonable time. Additionally, a lot of the work that's done for certified systems is in the nature of engineering change orders and de minimis changes. Those things go to the lab looks at the engineering change order and makes a determination as to whether it's reasonable that be put through. And then talks to us, and essentially it's a checkoff. Those very, very easy to do de minimis changes can be done literally in a matter of days.
Hours.
Hours,
Yeah.
in some instances, right. So again, it's a big question, Nate, and a lot of dependencies there.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? I know the old regime was bad and wasn't any good, and that's why we got rid of it, the 1990-2002 regime, but by an order of magnitude, how much would it have cost back in the day? When the pre-HAVA testing regime, I mean, how much?
Under NASA?
Under NASA, yeah.
In the initial stages, it would have been about $300,000 for software and roughly $350,000 on the hardware side, but those were in dollars of those days.
So that's not that different, given you factor in inflation if you're prepared, like Matt described.
Well, and as we discovered it during the NASA days, many of them were not prepared.
Yeah,
You know, they were coming in using us as beta testing, and
Sure.
and I'm guessing that's still going on. It
From time
hadn't
to
changed a whole heck of a lot. But it's not just the cost of testing at the federal level. I mean, you have to look at the cost of testing at the state levels too. But right now, the problem the problem continues to be for almost everyone, and that's the reason they're trying to bail out, is that the federal system is just not where it needs to be. And so we got to figure this out. And I think there's clearly attempts to make this work better, but there's not support at all levels here to make it actually function better.
Was the time frame this long? I mean, again, the ones who are, the standards, I know they're different, I know, but I'm just trying to figure out, like, the old business model for voting systems versus the current one that doesn't work. Like, I'm just trying to understand.
Yes,
The
it was
cost
faster.
at the time
It was
was
faster.
faster?
It was faster simply because.
It was easier to test, there were simpler standards.
Well,
right?
yeah, there are a whole lot of factors there. One, we didn't have the federal government.
Yeah.
God-awful structure of, publishing everything and studying everything and all of the things that they do. So we could move faster in that regard. We could make decisions internally with our technical advisory committee much faster than the feds are allowed to do. And so there's because it was sort of a state-controlled deal, but at the same time, let me say to you, we weren't doing at the same level and standard
Right.
that
Wasn't
these
as
folks are
thorough.
doing.
Wasn't as thorough. Yeah.
And the systems were much worse, too.
Yeah, correct. Correct. That's what I'm saying. I just trying to figure out the timing, the dollar amount difference.
Just a quick anecdote on that. When they were testing a VPAT, and that was before that standards, all the HAVA stuff was in place. And the guy doing the testing just literally turned over to me and said, "Is that good enough for you?" And I said, "Yeah, that works." And that was the standard.
Patrick?
I had a quick question to follow. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead, Wendy.
Just, before anybody moves off certification standards, I'm Wendy Noren. I'm the county clerk from Boone County, Missouri, and, I've been around so long. Then I've been through multiple systems, and I have purchased systems when there were no standards. I've purchased a system when they were the start of standards but no testing. I purchased a system when, as Doug had come in and brought a lot more professionalism to it. So, and each of them brought a better one. And I brought a system that went through the last 2002 standards. I haven't had the advantage yet of buying a system that'll do that. I can't tell you how important it is as an election official. Now, I'm the kind of person who actually reads the standards. And I've been reading the test reports and the test scripts of this equipment. So, and I'm unique in that, I know that. But it is absolutely critical that there be some kind of a testing process on a national level, because a lot of states don't do anything. And I came from a state which the certification process in my state was about what Larry Lomax said. It was the dog and pony show by the vendor. We did no more than what you all saw this morning on your demos or your rounds and a few questions like that. So it has been incredibly important to me that there be a testing process that I know that I can go and see what it's tested for, at least, that I know up front what the equipment is responsible for, what hasn't been tested. I'm responsible for designing a process to manage that. So I don't know how to work it out. The problem is, they talk about the FAA and the FDA. Well, those are corporations that have huge amounts of money that the drug companies are selling to and to doctors. These people are selling it to county government, which is the poorest unit in the whole world. I mean, this is not a big money-making business. And, you can over-design, you can do it, but we've got to have some standards and minimum standards on this so we know what we're buying, even if we know that it's a piece of junk and I've got to work all of these other procedures to overcome them. Dana was talking about how we had to do things to overcome the lack of decent equipment, and that needs to be clarified. Put out, tested, make sure we know what our part is and what the equipment can do.
I had one quick follow-up if I could, just really briefly. I had a question actually for Brian while we were still talking about certification, and it has to do with, in your testimony, you were talking about how, if I understood you correctly, that you say that there are some areas that might be ripe for a more targeted certification or a different kind of look at it. And I was curious what those areas might be, or if you really have thought about exactly what areas you might be able to take that and how that would improve the process.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I did talk about the manufacturer declaration of conformity process, and really what that means in a nutshell is the manufacturer would essentially certify to us, under penalty of whatever laws there might be, that yea, verily, they have tested the system to these standards. And again, let's just use some of the hardware standards, for example. They're fairly easy. They could go to any hardware lab out there. Some of them are mil-spec standards that are fairly well known. Can get them done anywhere themselves. Show them to our process, and we'd say, that's an accredited lab that passed the test. That's fine. So those things could improve the process significantly. There are other areas that we haven't explored, some potential for source code review, maybe some for technical data package review. Again, that's something we'd like to explore with election officials. We started that effort this summer and are going to continue that. So that's it.
Ron Rivest.
Thanks. I appreciate this opportunity to speak before the commission. For those of you that don't know me, I teach at MIT. I teach a class that covers homomorphic encryption, among other things. And I was on the TGDC, chaired the Security and Privacy Subcommittee, and so on, too. So this relates to security in general and certification in particular. So when we're talking about voting systems, as Brian Hancock said earlier, we need to think about what the high-level goals are. And if you want to get security right, you really only need to ask yourself one question and follow through with the answer carefully. The one question is, what do I need to show the day after the election to the losers that they lost fairly and squarely? That's the only thing that matters, right? If you can answer that question clearly and with full detail, you've solved the security problem. How do you convince the losers that they lost fair and square? Right? It's not just having a usable experience, a convenient experience. It's not just, you need to get the voters protected from coercion. You need to make sure that they're able to vote when they want to vote. You need to make sure their votes are collected and recorded accurately and tabulated accurately. But you need to do all that in a way that not only works, and that you as a vendor is convinced that it works, or that you as an election official is convinced that it works. You need to convince a skeptical, losing candidate that he lost. Right? And you talk about supporting the voter. The voters are not just voters. They are supporters of their candidates. And you need to convince the voters that voted for the losing candidate that they lost fairly and squarely. So supporting the voter means having an election system that produces the evidence that will convince the voters that supported the candidate that lost as well. Right? So this is really the top level question for security. Alan Kay said the right point of view is worth 10 IQ points. That question gives you the 10 IQ points you need on security. Right? How do I convince the loser that he lost fairly and squarely? Right? So it's not all about homomorphic encryption or standards for encryption, stuff like this, or other things. That, you start from the top and say, how do I convince the loser? What's the argument I need to make? And then you follow it from there. If you don't do that, you're only providing half a loaf on the election system. So, if we talk about paper ballots versus electronic systems, let's look at the arguments you have to make in those two cases. Would I rather convince somebody that these 10 million ballots were verified by the voters and the chain of custody was proper, which is the argument you need to make with a paper ballot system, which has got its complexities and its awkwardness, but you can do that. Or would you rather convince somebody this 10 million lines of code has no way of screwing up? I'll go with the paper ballots myself as a computer scientist trying to convince somebody that 10 million lines of code has no possibility of screwing up. I don't know how to do that, right? That's a state of the art. We find all the time. We got Patch Tuesday for Microsoft, issuing that's what they issue, right? They got the patches coming out every day. So, paper ballots have a simplicity and a simplicity of the argument you have to make that makes them attractive. I'm not a big lover of paper ballots, but I love the simplicity of the argument you can make based on a paper ballot system. Right, so it's good we have lawyers running the commission here to appreciate the evidentiary nature of this. What's the evidence the day after the election that the winner really won. That's what you care about in the security of an election. How do you make that argument? Again, looking at internet voting, it's convenient. I would love to be able to vote over the internet. I would love to be able to sit in my pajamas at home and vote over the internet. I would love to be able to text while I drive. I would love to be able to jump off tall buildings safely. I don't do any of those things, right? And I think I shouldn't, right? I think there's safety issues with these things, and I don't know how to produce for an internet voting system the evidence that the loser lost fairly and squarely. The internet system's got a very complicated collection of software components and routers and adversaries trying to come in over the internet to do this, trying to make the argument that the internet system, to make it convincingly to a very skeptical loser who doesn't trust the software that the vendor wrote because they maybe have been corrupted. They don't trust that the software that they ran is the software that they should have been running that was maybe certified. Trying to make those arguments for an internet voting system is really tough, at least these days. Maybe in the future we can do that. The nice thing about voting systems and internet voting is we don't need to go there. Right? For some applications, you sort of have to use the internet. You've got to do that. But in fact, it's nice with voting. We can stick with some of this tried and true technology that we've been using for a while, where the arguments are simpler, until and when the internet guys get the things figured out about how to make authentication and proof of correctness of these kinds of things work. That may happen in 10 years. I mean, we can ride the curve of technology and people need these kinds of things for other applications besides voting as well, and we can piggyback on their successes when they have them. But as yet, this contains a pile of software that I wouldn't trust to vote on, right? It just it's not there yet, and I think we need to wait until they solve that problem well, and it'll be there someday, but it's not going to be there today, and it's not going to be there in 5 years. It may be there in 10. We'll see. So. That's a summary of a viewpoint on security that contradicts some of the things that have been said here. I would also like to, just again to push back a little bit on this comment that the younger generation feels everything's got to be online. The younger generation is not stupid either. They like their convenience, but they see that the NSA is into everything. They see that the Chinese hacked Google. They see that Facebook abuses their privacy. They know that complicated electronic systems can be a source of abuse as well as convenience. And so I think if you make a simple argument to them that the systems aren't ready yet, they will accept that. So I don't think it's a slam dunk argument that we have to have internet voting in order to get the younger generation to vote. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you. On the same subject of security, Joe Hall, would you care to add something?
Thank you, Chairs Bauer and Ginsburg, Commissioners, for inviting me to speak. My name is Joseph Lorenzo Hall. I'm a Senior Staff Technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. Our mission at CDT is to keep the internet open, innovative, and free with deep engagement in law, technology, and policy. A little bit about myself. I have 2 master's degrees in astrophysics and information systems and a PhD in information systems from UC Berkeley, where I focused on policy mechanisms to increase transparency of essentially black box voting technology. You can think of me as half a lawyer, half a computer scientist, if you need to cubbyhole me somehow. I got my thoughts pegged to 5 minutes, so I'll just go. So first, funding and assistance to local election officials. The federal government should provide regular federal funding for election administration. Much of the instability in election administration comes from the veritable backwater that election administration and the voting technology market has occupied. Regular federal funding of elections with narrow, limited strings attached would begin to address this conundrum. Dan Tokaji and Thad Hall have proposed regular funding in return for comprehensive election administration data and reporting. And that seems like a pretty good bargain, given that we don't know a whole lot about our local election administration. And some of the people in this room, like Charles, go to great efforts to collect that stuff. And the effort to eliminate the EAC should just stop. The EAC provides valuable voluntary assistance, information, and technical evaluation, and the long tail of small local election administrators will increasingly need such support as things change only more rapidly. And we should make it a priority to seek commissioners and ensure the EAC is positioned to best assist local election officials to run high-quality elections. Voting system certification. I don't think voting system certification should be entirely jettisoned. I don't consider that an option, much like what Wendy talked about. It does not sound like a good thing to do. I do think certification in general should provide a floor, and it should be designed to establish a reasonable floor that focuses on vetting internal vendor development and quality assurance. New models like evidence-based elections that were mentioned earlier from David Wagner and Philip Stark, where you can avoid some of the front end of the certification process by proving afterwards that your elections met some auditability criterion and that it was a well-run election. We should begin to experiment and overlay those kinds of models on federal and state certification. Of course, one can certainly run a horrific election from a baseline floor, which brings me to my next point. We really need to design for auditability. The science and practice of post-election auditing has exploded in the past 7 years or so. The sad fact is that a lot of voting systems do not support more modern notions of what we call risk-limiting audits, although we heard, when I asked this morning, we heard quite a bit different. Vendors are doing amazing things these days with this kind of stuff. Laws have moved slowly. The market has moved slowly. This should be a major priority as it holds the promise to change our elections for the better forever. And I do not exaggerate when I say risk-limiting audits are the best public policy innovation in elections since the adoption of Australian secret ballot. Usable security. As usability experts in voting technology, notably Dana Chisnell, have said, if it's not usable, it's not secure. Security mechanisms that require bending over backwards, and not just security, but mechanisms that require bending over backwards by poll workers, voters, and election administrators will just simply not work. Voting systems have to have usability, accessibility, security, and auditability incorporated during the whiteboard design stages of development when it's just a thought in some engineer's head. These things cannot be bolted on later. Finally, parallelism in casting and in voter registration check-in. Voting methods and check-in methods that occupy an entire machine or a book or something in a serial manner, that is, one voter after another spending long periods of time either making selections on a casting device or trying to register to vote. Those just simply don't scale. Optical scan voting systems, ballot marking devices, poll books that you can walk through a line that require only quick interactions with voters and allow voters to mark ballots and register, check in very quickly, and do so in parallel, do scale very well. And the final thing I'll talk about, am I over? No, is we need to be wary, and this is entirely my own thought here, be wary of the erosion of the secret ballot. The secret ballot is probably the most important feature of democratic elections, working to ensure that election outcomes reflect unbiased voter preferences. No excuse vote by mail voting, as much as you don't want me to say this, and unsupervised methods of voting like internet voting are real threats to the secret ballot. It would be a tragedy if these convenience methods turned back the clock to the late 19th century, almost done, where voter turnout was high because election day was a payday. There's great research from Jack Heckelman at Wake Forest University that shows after the adoption of the Australian secret ballot in the US, turnout plummeted because vote buyers could no longer be assured of their investments. While I think many technical experts will concede that we need to figure out how to perform critical civic functions over the internet, it will be a while before authenticated civic transactions like driver's license issuances, social security card issuance, notary public, I mean, that's the whole point of having a notary public, and voting can happen in purely remotely forms. Finally, there are some lessons from this past summer of Edward Snowden that I deal with in my other national security role. Our government seems to think it should be able to tap everything, but the secret ballot is an existence proof that that worldview is just simply wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. One other point we want to touch on is voters with disabilities, because many of the cutting-edge things that we've heard in the process are driven by that. And so, Diane Golden, if you would.
Diane Golden with the Association of Assistive Technology Act Programs, and I'm sort of sitting here thinking, actually, what I'm going to start out saying is we haven't been all that successful in driving much in the way of the technology and industry, and at the risk of beating the paper ballot issue to death today, which actually I'm really, really excited because for the first time I'm not the minority, I don't feel like, in this group, which is really cool because usually I'm really getting beat up on over the paper ballot issue. You know, this has been such a polarizing issue, and sadly, part of it is contextual that I have to make sure you understand. When HAVA passed, and there was the promise, a legal promise of a private and independent vote for people with disabilities, literally, it was like another huge civil rights step forward for the community that I have dedicated my life to working for. I can't overestimate the degree to which this was hailed as something that was going to move the community forward. And it was all conditioned on or premised on the fact that Congress wouldn't have passed that mandate if they didn't think election jurisdictions could deliver a private and independent vote for people with disabilities. And they conditioned all of that on the concept that we were all going to be voting electronically and paperless. And it is relatively easy, technologically, to deliver a really robust set of access features when you're in an electronic format media. Once you introduce paper into the process, you have created really, really challenging accessibility barriers. And it is not anyone's fault, and it was not as if someone designed this conflict to happen, but because the law passed, we had some jurisdictions that deployed paperless, fully electronic voting, and then the tide turned, and the security issues, and again, I'm not here to redebate all of those, and many, many, many jurisdictions went back to paper. Literally, we had people who had rolled into their precinct the last election and voted completely privately and independently, and they rolled in this time and looked around, and rather than them voting on the same machine everybody else was using, and being able to vote privately and independently, they were back to the special machine in the corner is yours. Everybody else is hand marking an OpScan ballot. Your machine, you're going to have a poll worker help you because you can't get the paper in, you can't get the paper out, you've got to do this, I've got to set it up for you. And you cannot imagine the backlash that those of us in the advocacy community endured. Why aren't you stopping this? And it was just the circumstance. And so when people kind of wonder why there is such angst over the issue of paper ballots within the disability community, you have to understand from a public policy perspective, the worst possible thing happened. You gave it to people and then you took it away. Had they never had it, it probably wouldn't have been as big a deal. And I will actually touch on that a little later, but this was the worst case scenario from a disability access perspective. So I am providing that background just to say, literally, we in the disability community have been patiently waiting for 8 years now for a robust solution that is widely deployed, and we still don't have it. And we are so far from having it. It's going to be probably another decade before we are even close, if we remain in a paper ballot environment, to where most people with disabilities are able to walk into their polling place and truly vote privately and independently without some sort of assistance or something else having to intervene, or just saying, okay, I give up, I can't verify my ballot, but everybody else can, oh, whatever, kind of thing. So that's why the issue has such a emotional factor for the disability community. So having said that, and put a wet blanket over the whole thing, I'll go to the potential and promise of remote voting, even when it still involves a paper ballot at the end of the process. For many people with disabilities, they have always been forced to vote absentee because of transportation problems, because of inaccessible polling places. And I know election officials work very hard on that, but things happen. You just can't always ensure that it's going to be a fully accessible polling place, that my transportation that I arranged for actually shows up and gets me there. They don't. The lift's broken on the van I arranged. I'm stuck again. So a good number of people with disabilities are on permanent absentee lists, or whatever you call them in your state, and they vote on a paper ballot and somebody helps them fill it out or just fills it out on their behalf, kind of thing, and they resubmit it. So the idea of remote voting for those people, even if in the end it's producing a paper ballot, is actually a step forward, particularly if they are AT savvy. They have their own computer, they have their own computer access stuff, they probably have a scanner, an OCR scanner, et cetera. If you can deliver them an accessible format, in other words, something that is in HTML or something accessible, so their screen reader will work with it, they can scan it, they can do all of that, and even if in the end they print out a ballot, it still has improved the degree to which they are able to vote privately and independently remotely. So that shows real promise. The activities that people are doing with pre-marking a ballot and taking it in on your cell phone and a code and scanning it there and printing it, same thing. Again, are they going to be able to see what they print out there and make sure that's right? No, but it's a whole lot better than them voting absentee and just having somebody else mark it for them. So, so there is some. I mean, I think there's some promise in some of the innovations on that front. Also addresses the problems people with disabilities have with wait time. You just can't have somebody with muscular dystrophy trying to stand or sitting around for long periods of time in a polling place. They're just not going to last, period. So it will definitely help on that front. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is just the research we've been doing, which we think that people with disabilities are underutilizing the accessible equipment that is out there tremendously. I mean, we hear over and over and over again, I'm not going to use it, I don't know how to use it, blah, blah, blah kind of stuff. So we decided that we would try to provide demonstration and trainings on accessible voting systems and no value judgment on the system. It can be the best accessible system we've got, or it can be really crappy, don't care. It's got access features. All we wanted to do was provide demonstration and training, to see how long it takes Joe Schmo people with disabilities off the street, not at an NFB convention where all of these blind people are very tech savvy, or a United Cerebral Palsy convention where all of these people are connected and they've all got their laptops and their switches and everything, regular old people who probably don't have any of their own AT. How long does it take them to learn how to use these access features on the systems we have available, who have audio tactile ballots or large visual display, whatever? And then how long does it take them to cast a ballot using the access feature? And did that help? Are they more likely to go to the polling place and use the accessible systems? And very quickly, we've done probably 400 or so demo trainings now. We'll probably have 500-600 total in by the time we're done. And what we are finding is it takes an inordinately long period of time to get people comfortable using access features. Like you can get some people familiar and comfortable in a couple of minutes, but there are a large number of people that are going to take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. In other words, you cannot expect a poll worker or somebody at a polling place to take Joe Schmo off the street who has never used this access feature and get them up and running and using it on election day in the polling place. Not going to happen. So one thing that we think is really critical is getting equipment out into the community, into places where it can be demonstrated so that people can become comfortable and familiar. And we have done some pre-post rating scales with folks, and they tell us we've moved people on a 10-point Likert scale from a 4 to an 8. They come in saying level 4 comfortable using the accessible voting system, level 8 going out, and many of them have said it literally, we get close to 10% of the people who say, I didn't ever go in and use the machine, I'll go in and use it now. And I'll actually be able to tell the poll worker how to turn it on this time, kind of thing. So I think there's just a real need. We've got to acknowledge that those machines may seem intuitive to us, but they are not necessarily, particularly when you're using the access features. And we've got to do a whole lot better job. Maybe the younger crowd will kind of solve this problem, but for right now, we've got a lot of elders who need to use those access features, and they need a lot of help and support before they get to the polling place. So that's something, hopefully, my network of State Assistive Technology Act programs, independent living centers, there's a whole network of groups that could help with this. But the hitch is we have a very difficult time getting our hands on the voting equipment to use for demonstration trainings. And again, very legitimate reasons. It's proprietary. We only got so many of them. We have to get them in, clean them up for the next election. We can't turn loose. It's very difficult for me as a non-election official to just go to somebody and buy a voting machine. They're not really psyched about selling their voting machine to somebody who's not an election official. So somehow we've got to deal with that problem if we're going to actually get the equipment out in the community and get people to a level of comfort where they will go in and use it. Thank you. Before I forget, we also have developed this handy little guide, which is actually mostly for vendors and election officials, that runs through access features and functional limitations of people and tries to make sure folks understand that, you know, an audio output, speech output might be used by a whole lot of people beyond blind folks. Anyway, and it's written hopefully in a very simple form. It's also available online at www.ataporg.org under a voting tab, I think. So, thanks.
Thank you. We've gotten an awful lot of helpful information to the commission. I wonder if there are any wind-up questions that we've got. Commissioner McGeehan?
Actually, I had one question for John Wack with NIST. Was wondering, you know, you described how quickly you had to come around and adopt the standards in 2005, and some of the constraints. If let's say that we have a miracle and some of the stagnation, we work through that, and you have a certification program and standards to write, what would you do differently? And that's really not just for John, but anybody that involved with that process.
Could I ask you, what would I do differently in the standards or in the development of the standards?
I guess both. The development of the standards. I mean, if the commission is going to, you know, who knows, but I mean, if there's another way to go about creating standards that would create more flexibility.
Okay, I see what you mean. Well, I have my opinions, and I'm sure other learned people would disagree with them or have their own slants. So some of these are just my own opinions. But, you know, it's pretty clear that currently things aren't working correctly. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned a whole lot, and in fact, I noted down that I think Matt Masterson was getting at it earlier, was that you know, some of the issues with regard to security have to do with kind of a usability for election officials. I'll call it that. What happened was a lot of money was allocated to buy voting systems, and then the standards came in later, and mandates for security, you know, involving paper records came in, and we didn't have voting systems that were really usable for election officials to audit. So having this usability built in, and I was talking to Commissioner Lomax there before we started and recalling him describing when he was auditing VVPAT systems and laying out the roles on long tables, and it was nuts. You know, you can't expect election officials to use the audit features, you know, if they aren't usable. So a lot more rigor needs to be put into the standards process, in my opinion, when it comes to evaluating how the systems are being used by election officials. And, you know, can they be strung together quickly to, you know, accommodate for longer lines? Can they be audited more easily? Can things work out better in that regard? The other thing is that it shouldn't take, in my opinion, years to update the standards. Every time you update the standards, it shouldn't be a major effort. The standards ought to be written in a way that it's a lot easier to provide updates. The way I favor, and there are a lot of people who disagree with it, but it's just my own personal bias, is to write standards that have requirements that are higher level but have very specific tests. And the tests may change over time. We may elect to test things in a certain way for a period of time till technology allows us to move in different ways. And it shouldn't require an act of the commissioners to involve all this. I do think, though, that there's a lot of value in setting a specific time limit because otherwise people could argue forever. So I do think having a reasonable amount of time, 2 to 3 years, is still a good idea. And having a public process, the TGDC process was definitely very public, a lot of participation there, but it also tended to be somewhat slow. The IEEE process I'm involved in, I think is working better because we have more election officials involved and we have more manufacturers. There's still a role for anybody else who wants to be involved, but it was eye-opening once we started working with more election officials and manufacturers as well, who manufacturers work with all 50 states. And you can come up with ideas about how things ought to work, and they'll say, but Delaware does it differently. And it's very educational. And getting back to systems being usable by election officials. We have to focus on the voters and make sure the voters are able to vote accurately, but they won't be able to do that if the systems aren't set up well for election officials to use. So I would emphasize that a lot more in the research and still put a time limit on it. And I probably said enough. Thank you.
Doug, return question for you, if that's okay. You put a great deal of emphasis on the failure of Congress to act. As you know, federal legislative recommendations are not within our mandate, but I want to just clarify something on the record just from the standpoint of the analysis that you're pursuing. I think relating the absence of a regular updating of standards to the failure of to have a functional EAC, fully staffed with commissioners. But the other impression that you get from the testimony is that this problem's been going on for a long time. The suggestion that the standards process is slow-moving, the updates are irregular, and certainly over a period of time when the EAC was fully functional. That question, together with the question raised by Wendy Noren about do we need a federal presence, Kevin Kennedy's suggestion, well, maybe the states need the flexibility to step out of it. I would like to hear your more specific comments on that if you could.
The glacial pace initially was learning curve. Learning curve for the EAC in terms of commissioners getting comfortable with what they were going to have to say grace over. The actual process that the federal government itself goes through for vetting anything certainly was a learning curve, I think, for all. Even though Brian had been in government for a very long time, nobody had ever really at the federal government level done this kind of program that generated so much heat and so much concern and so much thought that it created a whole new series of delays. And so, and then funding issues got to be kind of a problem as we went along, and so some of that is explainable. Some of it is explainable. The other parts of this, it seems to me, is locked into what is the role of the EAC and NIST and the federal government in this process. Is the role to be a super regulator, even though that agency has no regulatory authority, or is the role to serve a customer base and to have an attitude that its success is really entirely dependent upon whether or not it serves state and local governments well in terms of being able to deliver voting systems in a timely fashion and what have you. And we haven't resolved that crystal concept at this point, and it seems to me that needs to be in the mix. I think the learning curve that we've gone through in terms of being able to do change order processes and so on, although with Brian saying today that, we were able to get something through in 50 days that probably should have gone through in less than a week. But again, he's strapped with a federal government process that NASA never had to worry about. And so this is part of the process. At the same time, we've got to kind of redesign the whole thing. It is not functioning well, wasn't then and is not now functioning well, at least to the customer base that we're listening to. At the state level and local government level, I got my rear end chewed because I've been a defender of the process for a very long time, and I got my rear end chewed by both states and local governments that the process was not working. And so it seems to me we need to sit down and think through, how do we do this in an open society with regulatory authority, with processes that demand that we go out to OMB and ask OMB for their permission to do crap, that takes forever. I mean, that's back to where we are. But we can't do it the way we're doing it. It isn't working. And if we're doing minor modifications to standards that are at least 12 years old, if not 22 years old, or whatever it is, 23 years old, then we're not serving the public. We're not serving the voting systems industry. We're not serving state and local governments. We're not serving voters. We're not doing any of it. And so the ultimate deal is we got to figure this out. I ultimately believe and still feel we're better off as a nation with it in a federal agency that finally is maybe redesigned to move faster than we are to turn this back to the states and let the states worry about it. Because here's ultimately what the states want to do. If you're going to turn it back to us, you fund it at the federal level. Well, the federal government is not used to just handing out money and saying do what you want to with it. And so this is one of those processes that if we're going to do this, we have to find a mechanism in which to fund it if we're going to take it back at the state level. And that to me means that we've come full circle. We went from states to federal government back to the states, but relying on the federal government to fund it. That's going to be a tough order, it seems to me.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate that very much.